Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're very welcome to the Centre Culturel Irlandais. Delighted to welcome John Banville back to the Centre Culturel. John has been with us on many occasions, but it's the first time that he comes with his Benjamin Black hat on to launch our first crime writing festival, Noire Emeraude. Which is in a way linked to our exhibition Surveillée. I hope you had a chance to see the exhibition, and if not, maybe you'll come back. We opened on Friday night with a wonderful audience of 600 for the opening, and we've already had 2 articles, so there seems to be huge interest in the subject of surveillance. So I'm going to hand over very quickly to our chair, who is a long-time friend of the Centre Culturel Irlandais, Clíona Ní Ríordáin, Professor of Translation Studies and Poetics in the Nouvelle Sorbonne. And thank you for being with us. Enjoy the evening.
Thank you very much, Nora, and it's really a great honour to be here tonight, interviewing Benjamin Black, who was born at the beginning of the 21st century, when John Banville sat down at his desk and penned, estimates vary depending on which paper you read, 1,500, 2,000 words in one go. And he wrote of the enigmatic Quirke, a pathologist who worked in the Holy Family Hospital in Dublin. And the book that emerged was called Christine Falls. It was published in 2006, and it was the first of a series of 6 novels to feature the enigmatic Quirke and his sidekick, Inspector Hackett, the Midlands man with a flat accent who only plays dumb. And Benjamin Black is also responsible for 3 other standalone books: The Lemure, published in 2008, The Black-Eyed Blonde, where he takes on the guise of Philip Marlowe, and most recently Prague Nights, which was published in 2016 and which appeared in the United States as Wolf on a String in 2017. And perhaps we might start with the most recent of the books, because it seems to me that that's the book where the membrane between Benjamin Black and John Banville is the thinnest.
Oh yes, I mean, I had done a book about Johannes Kepler back in the, my God, close of the Pleistocene age, I think it was. And I had, I'd done some research. For a novelist, that means there's always reading about 3 books. And I knew a bit about the period, and the beginning of that book was very strange. I can never remember where books start, but this one I do. This is Prague Nights we're talking about. I was walking my dog in the fields in Howth one day, and it was a day rather like this, beautiful autumn afternoon, and a name came into my head, Christian Stern. I don't know from where it came. And by the time I finished my walk, I had the plot worked out for this book. It took about 20 minutes. So it was a given. It was a trouvaille. And I had great fun writing it. Being Benjamin Black, it's a great relaxation from being whoever John Banville is. I mean, look, no writing is easy. We all know that, I always say, if you sit down and write a letter to your bank manager or your lover, and you come to the end of the letter and you look at it and you think, who wrote this? This is not what I meant to say. And it's the same for writers. We work in the dark and we're always lost. We're always trying to find our way out of a maze, the maze of language. And the same is true for Benjamin Black as it is for Banville. Banville has more difficulties, and Banville tries to be an artist, whatever that means, whereas Black is content to be a craftsman. So I decided to set this book in Prague, a city that I love, or used to love, before the tourists destroyed it. And of course, I was one of the tourists who destroyed it. So, but it was a wonderful city in those days. I was there before '89, when it was a far more interesting city than it is now.
You've written about it.
Not for the people who live there, but for us, people who dropped in and out. So it was a wonderful place to write about. And so that's what I did.
And it's a wonderfully atmospheric novel, and all of those creepy historical characters with the foibles of the court, and the sense, in fact, that somebody is going to say off with his head at any second, really keep you on the edge of your seat.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Yes, I mean, Prague around 1600 was an extraordinary place and time. The Emperor Rudolf II was, people always say to me, who was the first Rudolf? I can never remember. He was a very strange, melancholic, I suppose nowadays we would say he's mad, but he was just eccentric in those days. He was a great collector. He had these Wunderkammer, these wonder rooms full of things like unicorns, horns, and so on. And, I mean, when I was doing the Kepler book back in the early 1980s, I had to suppress so much of it because it was simply, literally incredible. People would not have believed it. It was such a strange time, such a strange man, and such a strange magical court, because he gathered all these alchemists together, paid them, supported them, and of course they all hated each other. So it was this strange infighting cabal of alchemists. And I decided that I would send an innocent into the midst of that court. To describe Christian Stern, my protagonist in the book, as innocent as being kind to him, he's just plain stupid. I like writing about stupid people because I'm one of them myself. Well, no, I am. I mean, I wouldn't recognize a clue if it came up and bit me on the bum. And neither does Quirke, and neither does Christian Stern. They are, I suppose, it just struck me, they are, like me, they're stumbling in darkness, trying to figure out the plot. Yeah, that's exactly what they're doing. They're trying to figure out the plot. And of course, the plot to me is of the least significance. One of the Benjamin Black books, I was about 3 pages away from the end. I still didn't know who'd done the murder. And I didn't care. It didn't matter. Raymond Chandler, the great American.
Born in Waterford. We might claim him.
No, he wasn't born in Waterford. His parents were born in Waterford. Extraordinarily enough, his father met Chandler's mother in America. Mm-hmm. She was born in Waterford. His parents had come from Waterford, and purely by chance, they met in America. And Chandler did come back to Waterford. I wasn't terribly impressed. But then I'm from Wexford, and we regarded Waterford as the other side of the moon. His local difficulties are ridiculous. But
do you think Chandler had a better sense of a plot? Or do you think he was all about atmosphere
too?
No,
that's what I was about to say. Chandler said, I don't happen to care who killed Professor Plum with the lead pipe in the library. I really don't. And famously, when John Huston was making the movie of The Big Sleep, they couldn't figure out who killed the chauffeur. And they phoned him up, and Chandler said, I don't know, I can't remember. And in fact, if you read the book, nobody killed the chauffeur. He just gets killed. Nobody cares. Nobody really cares about plot. If you think of it as we watch these crime series now on television, the Swedish ones and so on. And if you examine your conscience, you say, what was going on? You think, I don't know. I can't remember, and I didn't care. It's people, it's characters, it's what people do, how they behave. This is what's important in writing. This is what we care about. Because, Martin Amis wrote a book. Martin's a good friend of mine, but he wrote a book that I really envy the title of, which is Other People, a Mystery. Other people are always mysterious. I've been reading a lot of Simenon recently, rereading in many ways. The greatest. Well, you see, I don't like talking about crime writers. I don't like genre. When I give up this writing business and I open a bookshop, it's going to be alphabetical order. There'll be no, poetry, history, biography, and there certainly won't be that stand in the corner that says literary fiction, which may as well have a sign on it saying you don't want to come near this stuff. I would simply have, this, go through ABC, imagine the things you discover. So I don't like the notion of crime fiction. Simenon wrote some of there are at least a dozen of his books, which are masterpieces of 20th century literature. Nobody could surpass him. I read him over and over again to try to figure out how he does it, because he can set a scene in a line that would take me 3 pages to do. One of them begins, I can't remember which one, it says, the commuter people they were all coming out of the railway station, and she was the only one walking in. And immediately you're there. Now that would take me 3 pages to do. And John Simenon, his son, is a good friend of mine. I asked him, I said, is it true that when Simenon had finished a book, he would come out of his study and he'd line the children up and he'd say, "What am I doing, children?" And they'd say, "You're getting rid of the adjectives." And I mean, I wish I could get rid of the adjectives, but what would I be without my adjective?
But you have said that when Benjamin writes a long sentence or a good sentence, he has to stop.
Well, on those Tuesday afternoons when your concentration is lagging, boredom sets in, Banville will sometimes lean over Benjamin Black's shoulder and say, "Oh, that's an interesting sentence." And Black has to say, no, just write the sentence.
Can I read you a sentence?
Oh, God, all right.
And still the day refused to end. At 10:30, the sky, my bad writing, the sky was an inverted bowl of bruised blue radiance, except in the west, where the sunset looked like a firefight at sea, a motionless Trafalgar.
Is that a Benjamin Black?
That's a Benjamin Black.
God, he should be ashamed of himself. That was obviously a Tuesday afternoon where Banville managed to get one in. Sometimes Black will lean over Banville's shoulder, so we just tell a bloody story. Stop talking about the weather. Banville is always talking about the weather. Because for Banville, you see, people used to talk of me as a postmodernist writer in the days when postmodernism was still a word, nobody's interested anymore. But if I were to describe myself as anything, it would be that I'm a post-humanist writer and that I don't regard human beings as being the center of the universe. I think we are an accident, a terrible accident, a glorious accident, but we are an accident. And I see human beings as figures in a landscape, which is why I'm always talking about the weather and the landscape. And also that it's stupid of us to imagine that we are, we see ourselves as a sort of a test tube moving through the world. We're filled with silver, we're filled with mercury or something. We're moving through the world, unaffected by anything. But of course, the weather, the circumstances, the time of day, everything affects how we behave. So I can't understand how writers would imagine that, you just tell the story as if there were no outside influences. And again, I'll go back to Simenon. Simenon is always, even though he doesn't write in the way that I do, lyrically and poetically and all those things about the weather and landscape, he's always aware of, I mean, if you read any maker, even of the Roman Dur, they open with 2 or 3 pages of absolute superb landscape painting. He is, in a way, a wonderful nature poet. One of the best maigres is the one where he goes back to Saint-Fiacre, where he was born. It opens with a description of a small hotel very early in the morning, and it's just absolutely superb. And then at one stage, he and a man he knew from his childhood, he said they walked to the end of the road, and then this they caught the scent of chrysanthemums. And that's all he needs to do. Again, as I say, I would take 3 pages to get up to the point of the scent of the chrysanthemums. So the point, in a rambling way, the point I'm making is that the world affects us. Everything we do is affected by the world, even though we don't realize it.
But you have a very Maigret-like opening to Holy Orders when you have poor old Jimmy Minor being fished out of the canal. And the canal is a locale that Simenon likes. He has at least 2 novels.
He always returns to the canal.
Yeah.
There's something drew
So I was
Simenon
seeing
back.
that as a homage.
Oh yes, I mean, look, you see, I didn't start reading Simenon till, Simenon is the father of Benjamin Black, for good or ill.
And Patricia Highsmith is his mother.
Well, Patricia Highsmith is, her books are almost, they're repulsive. They're wonderful, but you think, oh God, I don't really want to read this. Whereas Simenon is saying, look, this is life. We may not like it, we may not approve of it, but this is how it is. And it is good and bad, and it is sweet and sour, and it's horrible and delightful. This is what makes him, as I say, one of the great writers of the 20th century. Poor Benjamin Black, he couldn't come anywhere near Simenon. Or even, look.
I think he gives him a good run for his money.
Well, thank you very much. That's kind of you, but old Black doesn't. Mind you, he'll go home this evening and say, oh, she said I gave Simenon a good run for his money. And Banville would say to me, in your dreams, yes. But there are other wonderful writers. Again, I would go back to the notion of genre. I was in Norwich last week where there was a crime writing festival. I hate the notion, even though, I'm sorry, I hate the notion of crime writing festival. What is crime writing? Why is it? It's like saying literary fiction. When I started out, there was fiction. It was either good or bad. It wasn't literary or whatever the opposite of literary is. What's a non-literary
Yes,
novel?
but you play on that yourself because you say things in your interviews, and I'm sure you're only trying to lead the poor interviewers astray, but you have said things in your interviews like, it takes you 3 months to write a crime fiction novel or a Benjamin Black novel or a detective novel, whatever you want to call it. And it takes you 2 to 5 years to write a John Banville novel. And you even have gone so far as to say that you write the Benjamin Black novels on your computer and the others you write in fountain pen in copybooks. And so, if you say there's no genre, well, you're not doing yourself any favors by talking about what poor old Benjamin is doing in that way.
No, really, there's a lot of misunderstanding about this. I'm talking about 2 ways of writing. I'm not talking about quality. I'm not making any judgment. I started to write the Benjamin Black books with fountain pen on paper, and it was too slow, because what that kind of fiction requires is spontaneity and speed, and it needs to be fluid. It needs not to be dwelt on. I have to write it as it comes to me, and therefore it goes quickly. The Banville books are a different kind of book, but only, again, you see, it's very hard to get, especially crime writers, it's very hard to get them to understand that I'm not making a value judgment here. I'm simply talking about different ways of working. If I wrote the Benjamin Black books in the way that I write Banville books, they wouldn't work. They would be a different kind of book.
So it's about rhythm, is what you're saying.
It's about rhythm. What I always say is that what you get with the Benjamin Black book is the result of spontaneity. What you get with the Banville book is the result of concentration. But this is simply 2 different ways of working. Mm-hmm. It's not a value judgment.
So you told us how you got the idea for Prague Nights, walking your dog. Where did Quirke come from?
Oh God, I don't know, and I don't like him very much. I don't find him very interesting. I like the people around him. His daughter Phoebe, for instance.
She's lovely.
My agent said to me one day, you're in love with her. And without thinking, I said, no, she's me. I suddenly realized that if there's anybody in those books, it's me, it's Phoebe. she's strange, she's troubled, she's like me, strange and troubled. Whereas Quirke is enigmatic to me. And it was quite funny, when I started to write the books, I described Quirke as tall and blonde and irresistible to women.
And
all
very
these things.
dainty feet.
Yeah, very dainty feet. And
Sorry, I distracted you
a
there.
woman wrote to me one day and said, I wish you'd stop talking about Quirke having blonde hair. He said, he hasn't, he has brown hair. And I wrote back to her and said, you're right. So I've darkened his hair. And then the BBC made a series, and Gabriel Byrne, the film actor, and he's about my size and dark. So I've been shrinking Quirke in each book. Imperceptibly, he has shrunk. He's got black hair, and but nobody notices. Everybody, when you read a book, you make the character for yourself. You envisage it. You envisage him or her. Somebody said to me, every time you describe Phoebe, she's wearing a little black dress with a little lace collar. Mm-hmm. And I said, yeah, I do, but that's how I see her. I can't imagine her in a slinky, scarlet ball gown. She's always nun-like, just as I am, as you see.
So what I think people find very interesting about Quirke is, and the Quirke series, is the place that Dublin plays. And you set them in the 1950s. And you've said about the 1950s that they were such a dark, dull, boring time. And at the same time, you have Phoebe saying, this is the 1950s, it's not the Dark Ages.
Yes, when I started to do these books, I made a pact with myself that I would not give Quirke or any of the characters in it the benefit of hindsight. We think of our world as being modern, and it is, 50 years from now, people will look back on our time and say, goodness, they ate meat in those days, and they look back on us with the kind of, not pity, but certain sympathetic sadness. But I decided I would not. So Quirke and Phoebe, they all see themselves as being part of a modern world. In the 1950s in Ireland was a terrible time. All those books are set around the middle of the 1950s when I was 10 or so. It was a dreadful time. A friend of mine saw the series on television. He said, I watched that series. And I said, did you not like it? He said, I was all right, but it made me feel that I was back in the 1950s. And I don't want to be back in the 1950s. It was a terrible but wonderful time to set these kind of books in. Ireland was completely repressed. There was no sex, there was no violence, there was no murders. It was nonsense, of course. There was lots of sex and lots of murders, but they didn't get into the papers. And I remember when I went to Eastern Europe first, mind you, a friend of mine in Eastern Europe said to me, oh, you're in Eastern Europe, are you? Where does that start? And he said, does it start here in Budapest? Does it start in Prague? Does it start in Berlin? Does it start in Paris? And I said, yes, point taken. There's no such thing as Eastern Europe, there's just Europe. But when I went behind the Iron Curtain before '89, I looked around and said, my God, it's Ireland. Because, of course, they had the Communist Party running their lives from the cradle to the grave, and we had the Catholic Church. The English historian Hugh Trevor Roper makes the point that Catholicism and communism are simply two sides of the same coin, and I think that's true. So it was the 1950s in Ireland was very repressed. Now, I'm sure there were people having a wonderful time, but I didn't know them, and I didn't know that they were having a wonderful time. I assumed everybody was having the kind of awful time that I was having. And it was a thrill for me to write about that period. And it was very interesting for me to see how much I could remember of it, to see how much I could dredge up out of my memory. And it was extraordinary how much stuff was there that I didn't know was there. But I would become obsessed by things, because in those days, motor cars didn't have indicator lights. They had a little orange thing that came out at the side. I'm sure none of you is old enough to remember this. A little orange thing would come out at the side of the car. And I couldn't remember the name of that. And I obsessed about it for about 3 weeks. What the name of that damn thing? that anybody else would care about it, but I did. And a friend of mine said, let's call it Traffic Aid. Wonderful, wonderful. Call it Traffic Aid. So I was able to put that into the books. And I can't convey to you the pleasure of finding a fact. And when you drop it into those kind of books, the books, in a peculiar way, the whole page crystallizes just because, I've found a fact.
The materiality of the object.
Yeah, yeah.
But you also are very good on the smells of Dublin at that stage. You have you have the smell of fresh horse dung and petrol fumes. You say that brings back Dublin to you at that time.
Yeah, well, you're too young to remember what the River Liffey smelled like in those days. My God. And then I used to work in the newspapers in those days, and I would come out in the middle of the night, and the entire city would be filled with the smell of Guinness hops brewing, which would fill the entire city. I can never understand why writers don't talk about smells. Our sense of smell is one of the strongest senses that we have. It's one of the most evocative. You can walk into a room and, you get a smell that you haven't, it will bring you back, somebody of my age will bring me back 60 years, on the instant. And yet writers never seem to talk about that.
It's very Proustian.
Does Proust talk about smells?
Well,
he talks about taste.
He talks about taste, but I mean, it's another
Taste,
sensory experience. And you have wonderful phrases like, you talk about...
God, you're not going to read another wonderful phrase. You know what Flaubert's mother said about him? She said, my son, he wasted his life in a mania for phrases.
Well, this isn't a phrase. This is you. When Quirke brings Phoebe violets, and he says that violets have the smell of death. And then when he meets people as he's going into the hospital, he says that they have the smell of recently bereaved people. So not alone are you evoking the smell, but you're also associating smells with particular objects or particular people, which I think is, wonderful for setting the scene for us.
God, all black is a better writer than I thought he was. Yes, well, the world is... there's a morning bell tolling. The dead are being wheeled out as we speak. I have a friend, and he said to me one day, he said, look, I admire your books, but I can't read them. I've given up reading because you do too much. He said, I just want to be told a story, and I'll fill in the details. He said, you fill in all the details. And that's true. I mean, it's true of Banville, and to a certain extent, it's true of Black as well. I'm an egomaniac, and I say to the reader, you are now entering my world, and this is what you're going to be doing. Don't try to skip. Don't try to use your own imagination. Become part of my imagination. It's a sort of tyranny. And sometimes when I'm correcting proofs in my books, I think, my God, if I was just a reader rather than the person who wrote this, I would throw it at the wall. It's too detailed, it's too immediate.
Well, that depends on the kind of reader you are.
Well,
Some
yes.
of us love to be plunged into somebody else's imagination, which is what happens when you read one of your books.
Well, there's a wonderful book by Christopher Ricks on Keats called Keats and Embarrassment. And you see, I always feel that the point of a work of art is that it puts you, and even if Benjamin Black books are craft works, but we leave that aside, it puts you, it grabs you by the back of the neck and says, look, this is the world. It presses your face against it. And if it doesn't conjure the world itself to the point where you're embarrassed, it sometimes seems to me that this is, well, I'll put it another way. The writer, let's forget about the artist. The writer describes an object, whether it's a stone in the road or a human being, describes it with such a depth of concentration that, like that chestnut, it says, I'm just an object in the world. I didn't expect to be concentrated on to this level. And it begins to glow, it begins to blush. It's the artist's duty to make the world blush. because that's when it becomes most self-aware, most vulnerable, but also most, well, there's a word somewhere that I don't know, but immediate, or none of these words communicate what I try to do when I write a book. I want people, as I say, to be embarrassed by
De rerum natura.
the rerum natura, yes. I mean, to be. I mean, what's the point of talking about something? You have to talk the thing itself. That's what Beckett said about Finnegan's Wake. He said, this is not about something, this is the thing itself. And every work of art, you know, you don't see it as its material. The great critic Collingwood, he made the distinction between craft and art. He said that art uses up its material. If a craftsman makes a beautiful table, you're aware of the wood, you're aware of what the thing is. But if an artist makes a great painting or a great piece of music or a great novel or a great poem, you cease to be aware of the medium, and you're lifted through it into reality itself. That's the point of doing art.
To come back to what you were saying about...
Let's get away from all that stuff, right?
No, but I'm trying to connect that to Quirke.
I'm sorry, I'm teasing you.
When you talked about, you know, being post-humanist, in a sense, you can see that Quirke is post-humanist as well, because he's a pathologist and he's deconstructing the human matter. And so there are all of these conversations between Phoebe and Quirke, where you get a sense that humans are objects for Quirke, and that's what fills Phoebe with indignation. Oh
yes, yeah. Phoebe's a human being, and Quirke is not. Quirke, I mean, he works underground. He works in the land of the dead. He works with the dead. He is. He's a kind of Eurydice, and without an Orpheus to come and bring him up from the underworld. And I remember thinking one day, that's my job, to get him up from the underworld. And the last Quirke book that I wrote, he falls in love with a German psychiatrist. Absolutely perfect. Perfect for Quirke, a German psychiatrist.
He's a bit too happy at the end of that novel.
And she is bringing him up from the underworld. And I'm not sure that I know what to do with him. I wrote another Benjamin Black book last year, and I've introduced a new character, and somebody says, you know, where's Quirke? And he says, he's on his honeymoon. The notion of Quirke being on a honeymoon. Maybe he's gone for me, you know, maybe he's gone. I mean, Philip Marlowe made the mistake of I always mix the two of them up. Raymond Chandler made the mistake of marrying off Philip Marlowe, and Marlowe never recovered. So maybe Quirke won't recover. But let him be happy. I'll find other people to write about. But I would find it very hard to let go of Phoebe, or Hackett, Inspector Hackett, whom I like very much. You see, my ambition is, we were talking earlier about genre and about crime fiction. The trouble about writing a crime book is that there has to be a crime in it. And that's immediately, it curtails your freedom. So my ambition has always been to write a crime novel without a crime in it. And in Elegy for April, the corpse of April is never found. So I'm going to bring her back to a future book. That means that retrospectively, I will have written a crime novel without a crime.
Ah, that's wonderful.
Yeah, my new guy is called St. John Strafford, and he's a policeman. He knows Quirke and so on. He's Anglo-Irish, Protestant, which is interesting. But he's going to meet April somewhere. I think I'm going to, in fact, my Spanish publisher and I have agreed that I will bring, I fell in love with the town of San Sebastian recently. I'm going to bring St. John Strafford to San Sebastian for some reason, and he's going to meet April Latimer, who's supposedly dead, and they're going to have an affair.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So
So watch this space.
Watch this space. This is the great fun of writing this kind of fiction. I didn't know that I was interested in character and dialogue and plot and all that stuff until I became Benjamin Black. And since then I've been like a child playing with these. I mean, when I wrote Christine Falls, that first book, I thought this would, I would do this and then I would give it up. And then I became interested in the characters, and I've written 6, 7, 8, I don't know how many. And I'm having great fun.
Yeah, so it's the idea of seriality and the idea of familiarity with a period and with those characters. That's what's giving the fun.
Well, I suppose so, but you see, my most recent book is a sequel to Henry James's The Portrait of a Lady. Mm-hmm. And again, I had great fun doing
Mrs.
that
Osmond.
because Mrs. Osmond, I mean, I wasn't there when it was happening. As Woody Allen said about death, I don't mind dying, I just don't want to be there when it happens. When I'm writing these books, I'm not there. I wrote a lot in this book, Mrs. Osmond, the Henry James sequel. I now refer to The Portrait of a Lady as the prequel. I was teaching, quote unquote, in the University of Chicago, and I had an apartment on campus, and there was absolutely nothing to do. There were no pubs, no restaurants, I had a weekendless week, which was my ideal. I didn't know what day it was when I just wrote and wrote and wrote. And sometimes I would watch my hand, I would lean back and watch my hand writing. There was, it wasn't me. And
Automatic writing.
I did that very quickly. I mean, that's a long book, and I wrote it in a year. So it's not a Banville book. I should have invented another name. It's Oscar Wilde said, "Give a man a mask, and he will tell you the truth." In a curious way, when I have a mask, it's much easier to write because I'm not there. My ego is not involved in it in a strange way that I don't understand. Psychologists, even neurologists, say that we have this capacity to induce ourselves into a state of hypnotism. When we have a task to do, that's the kind of thing that we usually do, but not exactly what we usually do. In other words, it's a task that has to be performed, that we can hypnotize ourselves. And I think that's true. When I wrote the Raymond Chandler, Philip Marlowe novel, I wrote it over a summer, over about 3 months, and I have no memory of it whatsoever, none. When I look back, I just see a blank. So obviously I was in some strange way hypnotized. Can't remember doing it, can't remember how I chose to write in this, And when I was doing the Henry James book, I would use words that I wasn't sure of the meaning of. For instance, he talks at one stage, I was making an elaborate Henry James joke. Henry James joke is no laughing matter, as what's his name said about a German joke. But the character of Isabel Archer is having lunch with a vegetarian, and everything comes up, all these vegetables. And I was writing, I always say he was writing. And he said that one of the vegetables had escaped the ebullient cauldron, Henry James joke. I didn't know that ebullient meant boiling. And I used it, and then I went and looked it up, and I discovered that it was the right word to use. That's very strange.
Maybe you were inhabited by the spirit of Henry James.
You see, I'm not mystical. I don't, for a moment, there is no spirit of Henry James. He's not anywhere. He's gone.
Well, Yeats believed in that.
Yeats.
I mean, he had Georgie to do it for him.
Yeats. Georgie said wonderfully about Yeats. She said, "Oh, Willie, all that, what was it, that nationalistico, mystico, something like that." He said, it was all just a way of making poetry. Yeats didn't believe any of that stuff. Although, I'll tell you a very strange story. Well, anecdote. I was in Sao Paulo in Brazil at some kind of Irish literary festival. In the days when I'd go to Sao Paulo to a literary festival. And Anne Saddlemeyer is Georgie's biographer. was giving a talk about it. And she was in a room about this size, and she was standing by a window which had Venetian blinds on it. It was a perfectly still day. Right? When she began to talk, the Venetian blinds suddenly went as if a huge gust of wind had blown against them. And everybody in the audience went, and she said, "Oh, it's all right, it's just Georgie. She does that." So who knows? And again, when I was young, thousands of years ago, I lived in a flat in Upper Mount Street, and the person in the flat below mine was Anne Yates, Yates's daughter. And she and I would meet, and we would have conversations on the stairs about various things. A nice woman. But I was going up to my flat one day, and she was standing there with a little old lady in a woolly hat. And the little old lady in the woolly hat just kind of looked at me. And years later, when I was reviewing Anne Settlemeyer's biography, there was a photograph of the little old lady in a woolly hat. And I realized that was Georgie Yates. And I remembered the look that she gave me. It must have been 40 years would have passed. And the hair stood up in the back of my neck remembering that look. Because the strange thing about Georgie Yates was that some people said she had blue eyes, some people said she had black eyes. I remember her as black eyes. And I even still, I feel it. She just looked at me with that strange, strange look. So maybe there is a world of the spirits. Maybe Henry James did. Maybe, I mean, Raymond Chandler would have killed me with drink before he would let me write a book of his. Henry James might have approved, because he recognized himself that the portrait lady wasn't finished. Sorry, I'm rambling on. Ask me another question.
You talk about pressing the writer up against reality and the window of reality. The reader, sorry. And I think one of the things that strikes us most forcibly when we, as I did this summer, reread the novels, was how what appeared in your novels at the beginning of 2006 was so proleptic in a sense, and anticipated all of these reports that came out much later, 10 years later, the Ryan report and all of the things that emerged from the laundries and the orphanages. And I know that this year Declan Kyberd wrote an article in the Irish Times where he said that, the writers said the things people said. These things were never mentioned. Nobody knew about it, but they were in the writing. Were you aware of that when you were doing it?
Of course. I mean, look, one of the reasons that I'm not very popular among the Catholic establishment in Ireland, and there still is a Catholic establishment in Ireland, don't fool yourself, there isn't, is that when one of these awful reports came out years ago, I wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times, and I began by saying, everybody knew. Everybody knew. We knew in that peculiar way that the Germans had, or the people in Bosnia had, that peculiar capacity that we have to know and not know at the same time. Everybody knew about these awful industrial schools. We didn't know the extent of it. God forbid that we should, but my parents knew. There would be kids sitting in the back of the class when I was a little boy, and they would disappear, and nobody would mention it. They'd gone off to an industrial school, or God knows what's happened to them. And as for girls, Jesus Christ, I mean, the treatment of young women in those days was absolutely appalling. Look, don't get me started. My blood pressure will rise. But everybody knew. Of course we knew. And we didn't know at the same time, because if we admitted that we knew, we would have to do something about it, and then our lives would change. But the church was an absolute power. I remember walking along the street in Wexford one day, and there was a very heavily pregnant woman pushing a pram, and a priest was walking towards her, or parading towards her, as they did, the princes, the owners of the masters of the universe, and she stepped off the pavement into the road to let him pass. It was disgraceful, but it was the time. And go back to an earlier question of yours, it was the time. We knew and we didn't know. I'll tell you a little story. It's one of my favorite ones. When I was 15, a couple of Jehovah's Witnesses came to Wexford. Rather sad little pair of English, man and woman. They rented a house and they used to come round. I used to talk to them on the doorstep. My mother would talk to them as well, because my mother was although she was a devout Catholic, she wasn't a bigot. But anyway, one Saturday afternoon, Father Tom Sinnott, a name, I always name him, big red-faced, ignorant farmer's son. He led a mob up to the house where this couple were living. He'd had a few drinks at lunchtime. And he dragged the Jehovah's Witness man out in the street and beat him up and told him, "You and your whore better be on a train out of here this evening," right? And so I had long arguments with my mother about this, and she said, "I know it's terrible and he shouldn't have done it, but it's the church, and I have to obey it." But the happy ending to this story is, a few years later, my brother showed me a little paragraph from an English newspaper saying, "A Father Thomas Sinnott was arrested in Manchester for stealing ladies' underwear from Marks and Spencer's." And I thought, there is a God, there is a God. And sometimes he does a little bit of justice. Sorry, where did that start out?
But Quirke,
Never ask somebody of my age about those times, because we get so furious. And of course, the fury is infused with guilt. I knew about it, I didn't do anything.
Quirke does something, though. Quirke
No,
is
he doesn't.
Quirke tilts at windmills. He's a Don Quixote figure.
What's the
in
point
a
of
sense.
tilting at windmills?
But he attempts to do things.
No, he doesn't really. He attempts and he fails. He and Inspector Hack. That's what I like about these books. Nothing happens. Nobody's ever brought to justice.
Well, when we go to the last of your Quirke series,
Yes,
there-
remind me. Son.
you do have somebody who falls off a bridge and has his neck broken.
Who's that?
The strong man who's responsible for beating Quirke up, and you have the little lighter from the battle.
Yeah, but that's not justice. That's the accidents of life. I mean,
No, that's
well,
Quirke.
maybe divine justice.
No,
or-
that was Quirke going to tell the father of the man who died in the car accident, supposedly.
Yeah.
And the clue at the end is the Zippo lighter.
Clues, yeah. Clues
Yeah.
is great. Has anybody ever found a clue? You suspect your spouse of having an affair. Have you ever found a clue? You suspect somebody's stolen money. Have you ever found a clue? Clues don't exist.
Mobile phones are great for clues, for effect.
Are they?
Yeah.
Do you speak from bitter experience, darling?
Not at all, but I know that has happened.
Ah, yes. Well, I've sent many a text to the wrong person. By the way, there's a system now on. I've just got a new email thing on Firefox or whatever it is, and it allows you 5 seconds to undo the email that you've sent. It's wonderful. It comes up and says, "Do you really want to send this? Do you want to cancel it?" I think I'm inclined to cancel all of them, just in case, But no, I mean the world is not a detective novel. The world is not. There are no Sherlock Holmeses. There are no Hercule Poirots. I mean, there couldn't be, because the world is not. People used to say about my Banville books, "Oh, he's very bad at plot," and I always wanted to say to them, "Does life have a plot? We drift along. It's all chaos. It's all fumbling our way through the darkness. There are no plots, and I try to honor that in the black books. That yes, people are doing things, and there's a character called Costigan. Maybe he's the one who got
Yes,
killed.
he's the person who gets it in the neck.
And
Sorry, spoiler.
it's one of the. Oh, they'll bear it. In one of the books, and it's the central exchange in these black books where Costigan says to him, "You think that you live in the real world." He said, "You don't. You live in a world of dreams. You live in a world of fantasies. You people," he said, "it takes people like me, nasty people like me. We do the real work in the background." And that's one of the horrible things about life, that we live by fantasies. that we'll never die, that people like us, that people are inherently decent, all this stuff, you know, that it's a fantasy. It's a wonderful fantasy, and it's how we live. But we shouldn't imagine for a moment that it's the truth. The truth is a far darker thing. And is there such a thing as truth? Maybe Costigan is wrong. You know, we live in a relative world. We can never know what's going on. You know, I certainly don't know what's going on. And when I was young, I thought that when I got old, I would be wise and, you know, would have learned about the world. Age doesn't bring wisdom, it brings confusion and silliness. And, you know, I'm even sillier now than I was when I was young. And thank goodness for that. Otherwise, life would be very grim.
Or perhaps it brings the clarity to know that things are confused. I mean, you have several newspaper owners and reporters in the Quirke novels. And in a sense, what they're anticipating is the whole notion of fake news, where you have Johnny Minor, his death is transformed in the newspaper headlines. You have Dick Jewell, whose death is disguised in the newspaper headlines. And then you have the scene when you have the proprietor of the newspaper in Holy Orders, Carlton Sumner, who comes in and who tells the editor what to write, and who tells him about plot, and who tells him cherchez la femme. So you're suggesting all of those things.
Yes, but I worked in newspapers for 35 years. I know whereof I speak. The notion that I remember doing an interview with a French journalist. She was visiting Ireland. She was a very good interview, and she's a very intelligent woman. And I said, you know, since I stopped working in newspapers, I don't read newspapers. And she said, well, how do you know what's going on? And I said, do you think newspapers tell you what's going on? She said, yeah, I know what you mean. People imagine that newspapers, or used to imagine that newspapers were a sort of disinterested social medium. Newspapers are businesses, and they will print what sells. You can't be... The truth doesn't exist in newspapers. The best you can do is take a glancing blow at it, but there's always been fake news. News was always fake. I'm here to tell you, it was always fake. It wasn't lies. You see, that's where Trump and his people were very clever. They didn't say they're telling lies. They said, you know, they're telling alternative facts, which of course is nonsense. But they are, I mean, the awful thing that we liberal, well, good-minded people have to admit is that Trump and his people are saying, yeah, you've been carrying on this facade, the charade for years, and we're here to tell you, you know, we're going to say, we don't care. You know, yeah, we're lying. You know, this Robert Mueller's thing will come out on Trump, and it'll find him absolutely guilty of everything. You say, yeah, so what? And all of his followers will say, yeah, so what? And we mustn't forget, Bill Clinton stood up in front of the media and said, I did not have sex with that woman. He'd had a great deal of sex with that woman. Richard Nixon scuppered the Vietnam peace talks in 19-whatever it was in order to get elected, caused the deaths of tens of thousands of people. Going back even further, Lyndon Johnson invented the so-called Tonkin incident to give himself absolute powers in waging the Vietnam War. Trump is not new. He just happens to be inept and stupid. I mean, even more stupid than the people around him, that he's telling us what goes on. But it always went on.
And some of that emerges in I think, more in the Benjamin Black novels than in the John Banville novels.
Yeah, well, Banville's not interested in the world. Banville is interested in striking past what happens in the world to get at the essence of things, to get at a kind of poetic truth. You know, if you read the great novelists, the great poets, the great dramatists, they're not talking about actual reality. They're talking about the truth behind what we do. I mean, everything that we do is a fantasy. We invent ourselves at every moment. We have this fantasy that we are singular beings. This is left over from religion. We have the notion that there is a soul, there's a pilot light burning in there permanently that is me. There's no such pilot light. There's only the people that I invent. As T.S. Eliot says, we invent the face to meet faces that we meet. I'm a different person sitting here than I will be when I go for a drink with you later, or when I go and see my missus and my daughter. I'll be a different person when I go back to Ireland. I'm a different person at every moment of the day, and a good thing it is. Imagine how boring life would be, and imagine how boring the world would be if we were all singular beings. We'd be little robots walking about. What's wonderful about human life is how we invent ourselves and reinvent ourselves and have to reinvent ourselves at every moment. This is what makes life thrilling. You never know what you're going to be in 10 minutes' time, in 10 seconds' time. Isn't that true?
Yes. Can I come to your, perhaps the last questions of the evening about, you talk about everything is a fantasy and everything is the imagination. I just wanted to dwell a bit on the fantasy of France that emerges from some of these novels. And in particular, you have Françoise d'Aubigny.
Oh, yes.
And you have her, you say that she's one, like all French women, she's one of two things. She's either sultry and smouldering or cool and detached. And I was wondering whether that was your fantasy of France and French women.
That's Benjamin Black, and it's Quirke. It's Quirke's fantasy. Of course not. Is this a trap?
No, not at all. Far be from me to trap you.
Look, I've been coming to France since I was 18, and I can tell you Paris in those days, which would have been the early 60s, was a very different city to the city that's here now. I remember walking down a street, I was thinking about it today, because this was after the Algerian War and before the student unrest and so on. And the police force was essentially filled with people who'd come back from Algeria, and they were very angry people, and those pieds noirs people who'd come back. And I was walking down the street, and there was some little protest was going to take place in some street, and I was walking towards it, and there were 10 police vans, police vehicles, and each of them had about 12 young policemen in it, dressed in black, padded, and they were all sitting there, hitting their batons into their hands, just waiting to get at them. It was a very different place. It was practically a police state. So I have no illusions about France, except that I am a complete sucker for Paris. I don't care what's happening in the banlieue. I don't care about, the Islamists out there boiling with rage. Paris, to me, is still this little part of Paris that I can walk around, and I'm not giving up that fantasy to anybody. I'll die with it. I'll probably be blown up by one of the people from the banlieue. And they say, see, this is the real Paris. And I say, oh, well, okay. But until then, this is still the most exquisite city. Oh, my God. A friend of mine, an English friend of mine, he lived here for a few years. And he thought, oh, I'm going to move back to England. And he was coming back to his apartment in France to pick up his stuff. And he was driving past this Place Saint-Sulpice at about 2 o'clock in the morning. And there was Catherine Deneuve walking her two Borzoi dogs. And he thought, maybe I'll stay for another while. And my daughter, who lives here, and she's lived here for the last 5 or 6 years, she says, oh, I'm going to come home. Then she comes home for a week, and he says, maybe I'll go back to Paris. It still is the most beautiful, beautiful city. And, that same friend of mine, I said I was going to Paris for the weekend. He said, how are you going to manage your food and drink when you're there? So, I'm not saying that because I'm in Paris. I would say that anywhere. And I have other cities that I love equally. But I'm a sucker for Paris.
I think that's a wonderful note to end the evening on. Thank you very
much.
much.
What a fraud you'll all go away saying.